Tonight's speakers will challenge your faith in our legal system. But when you meet Elisa Kaplan, you'll be thankful that there are people like her who champion justice. And when you meet Dennis Maher, you'll be awed that someone who suffered such a terrible injustice is still able to live with as much dignity, compassion, and wisdom. Let's hear your story, Dennis.
Good evening. Thank you for having me here. In 1978, I graduated from high school and enlisted in the service. I went through basic training in AIT in Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri. From there, I went to Georgia and went to jump school and became a paratrooper. From there, I went to Fort Bragg, North Carolina, and served with 7th Special Forces. While at Fort Bragg, I volunteered to serve overseas and went to serve in Italy with the 1st of the 509th. While there, I re-enlisted and came home to Massachusetts. On the night of November 17th, 1983, I was walking down the street in Lowell, and I was stopped by the police. They asked for identification. I gave them my driver's license. I didn't even have a speeding ticket, so it came back negative. And then he searched me, and he arrested me for possession of marijuana. So he arrested me, and he took me down to the police station. He booked me. And then about 2 hours later, they took me out of the room and they started questioning me. Where were you on the night of November 16th around 5:30? And where were you on the night of November 17th around the same time? So I told them on the night of November 16th, I was in my CO's office until 5:15, and we were getting yelled at because we failed a nuclear biological chemical test. Now, I lived in Lowell at the time. It's 18 miles to drive from Lowell, from Fort Devens to Lowell. And so I didn't get home till 5:45, 10 minutes to 6. And then they said, well, where are you on the night of this November 17th? I said, well, I left work early because I had to get my car inspected. And I went home and I took a nap and I went over to my friend's house. So he put me back in the cell. About another hour later, another police officer takes me out. And I started asking me the same questions. I give him the same answers. And finally I said, well, what are you questioning me about? And he said, we're questioning you about a rape and an attempted rape that happened on the night of November 16th and 17th. I said, well, I think I need a lawyer. So the next morning they brought me into court. And they did what's called an in-court identification, where they took me out of the box and they sat me in a chair. And they brought the victim in to see if she could identify someone. She identified someone else, so the judge said they had no grounds to go forward, so they gave me 6 months probations for possession and said I could leave. Now at this time I was in stocking feet because they had taken my boots. And as I was leaving the courthouse, they arrested me again and charged me with the crimes that they just were told they had no grounds to go forward with. So I went to court in Cambridge and got out on $10,000 bail. And a few weeks later, I had my first lineup. It was me, 6 police officers. All the police officers were standing behind a railing. I was standing behind a chair. I was identified. I went for my next lineup. Same thing, me and 6 police officers. I was ID'd again. In March of 1984, I went to trial. And I was found guilty. And the judge said, Mr. Maher, do you have anything to say? You know, being a 23-year-old soldier, of course I did. I said, Your Honor, if you call this justice, I think you and your whole judicial system are a crock of shit. Wrong thing to say to a judge. He sentenced me to 20 to 30 years in prison. But before that, on the night of January 5th, I was arrested again and charged with aggravated rape in the town of Ayer. So I had another trial in April. I was found guilty again. And the judge said, Mr. Maher, do you have anything to say? I said, no, Your Honor. And he sentenced me to second-degree life, which means you do 15 years till you're eligible for parole, but they never have to parole you. So now here I am, I'm 23 years old, I'm doing a 20 to 30 second-degree life for something I didn't do. So I went to Walpole. While there, I was cut, I got 3 stitches here, and I got 14 stitches across the back of my neck because I was in prison for a sex crime. Even though I didn't do it, it didn't matter. While there, I met with a Dr. Moore, and he went to see for a sexually dangerous hearing. So they sent me to the Massachusetts Treatment Center, and I went through the hearing, and some of the things to get committed from would be denial, I didn't do the crimes, multiple offenses, there was 3 crimes, and violence, there was a knife involved. So I was found to be sexually dangerous and sentenced to 1 day to natural life. So at this time, I'm about 26 years old, doing a 20 to 30, second-degree life, and 1 day to natural life. The 1 day to natural life is a civil commitment. So even if I was to get out on probation or parole, I would still be in prison for the civil commitment. So this whole time I'm keeping stuff in court to try to keep the evidence held and work on that. And then around 1993, I'm walking back from the block from work, and everyone's yelling, "Dennis, put on Phil Donahue, put on Phil Donahue." And I saw Barry Scheck. At this time, the Innocence Project was in its infancy, and they had probably gotten out 6 or 7 people. So my friend Bob Cameron, who has since died, helped me find the address, and so I wrote a letter asking for help. They sent me back a 27-page questionnaire, which I filled out, and I sent it back, and then they sent me another questionnaire, and I filled that one out. And then they said they needed all my transcripts, all the motions that I've ever filed. Now, 2 trials, everything I've ever filed in court is, I kept stuff in court all the time. So I sent them about 1,200 pages of documents. And now the way the Innocence Project works is students start looking at the case, and they look to see if they can find evidence. Well, these students were getting frustrated because they kept telling them the evidence was destroyed. So in 1997, Barry Scheck had someone in Massachusetts file a motion for DNA testing. It was denied without a hearing, where everything I ever filed in court was denied without a hearing because all of it went in front of Judge Barton, who was my sentencing judge. And I think he had an issue with me. So at this time, I was devastated because my hopes were that DNA testing was going to set me free. So a couple of years later, I get a letter from the Boston Globe from John Ellerman asking if he could talk to me about DNA testing. You know, this is a piece of straw, so I grabbed onto it. We sat and we talked for probably 3 hours. And then he told me, he said, you know, your judge retiring in June. I said, okay. And he didn't do the article on me. He did the article on Ulysses Rodriguez-Charles, who was proven innocent through DNA, and Benjamin Laguerre, who had a DNA match.
He was not innocent. He was my client also.
But he had told me that Judge Barton was retiring. The day Judge Barton retired, I called the New York Innocence Project, and I asked them for help. The student said, I don't know if I should even answer this, but he did. And he said, you need to contact the New England Innocence Project. And he said, it's at Testa, Hurwitz, and Tebow. And then I went and I found the address. And I wrote them a letter and got back a 27-page questionnaire, which I filled out. And then they asked me for the transcripts and every motion I've ever filed, so I sent that to them. And then one day I was walking back to the block, and the block officer says, Maher, you have an attorney visit. I said, I haven't had an attorney in 12 years. So I went upstairs, and it was Eliza.
My turn?
Yes, your turn.
Okay. So I'll just do a little bit from my perspective up until that point, and then we can go forward. And I also want to just thank everyone so much for having us in this beautiful shul. It's a real honor to be here. So from my perspective, the New England Innocence Project was founded, some of you may know this, so I apologize, out of a law firm that no longer exists called Testa, Hurwitz, and Tebow. I was a second-year attorney I finished a clerkship for a federal judge, and I went to Tester Hurwitz as a second-year associate. And within the first couple months, one of the partners came into my office and said, "We're starting an Innocence project out of the firm." You know what that is, right? And you know, in the 90s, unlike today, law students we didn't learn about wrongful convictions. But we all sort of heard in the background, like Dennis heard on Donahue, that there was this thing happening in New York where people were using DNA, and it started to become a reality. So by the time I got to my firm a few years after law school, it was something that a lot of people had started to develop interest in. There was I don't know how many exonerees, 50 exonerees by then, around 2000. And this amazing partner in our law firm decided he wanted to do this in New England and cover the New England states. And he appointed 2 or 3 of us new lawyers and a paralegal, and he said, and this was the 90s, so it was a very big firm time, and so he said, just bill it like you would any other client. And so my first year at my law firm, I billed almost half of my billable hours, 900 billable hours, if people know what that means, to working on innocence cases, going to prisons, doing presentations, hiring law students from all the local law schools here in Boston, and really getting sort of the shop up and running with a few other attorneys and paralegals at my firm. So we created the New England Innocence Project, and Dennis was, in the handful of first cases that we not only heard from individuals, because people started writing us because we were asking them to write us, but also the New York office, which works nationally still today, was sending us all of their boxes. Hey, you want some New England cases? Here you go. So Dennis is just sort of randomly was one of the first ones that we were digging through. And we had seen that the national office had helped him file a motion once, this motion for DNA testing, and there was no mechanism back then in Massachusetts or in 48 other states, actually, at that time, to actually bring a claim for DNA testing. So anyone that wanted to, even if they found the evidence, and we hadn't yet found it in Dennis's case, even if you could find the evidence, there was no legal mechanism to ask the court to subject it to testing. Today, 50 states have that law, but back then, only 2. And Massachusetts was not one of them. So we were going through Dennis's stuff, and we said, this is really interesting. This guy's worth a visit. Let's go meet him. And I like to do that today still. If the prison's not that far, I always say to my students, let's go meet them. First, it's a great thing to do with a student, right? Because it's a great experience, and you get to meet a client and use your interviewing skills and all of that. But it's also, when you do this kind of work, it's really important, I think, not that you can look in someone's eyes and know anything, but it's just something that really helps you think about it when you're working for years often on these cases. Dennis's case that we worked on he had worked on it obviously for 1 million years, but we worked on it actively for 2.5, 3 years until he came out. So it's really, great to have a face connected to that and more of a relationship with someone that you're going to be speaking to on the phone all the time. So a student of mine, Karen, came with me, and we had studied his case and knew things, and we went to meet him. And this had never happened to me before, and to this day, this has never happened to me before, and I've worked on a lot of these cases. When we got to the prison and we went through all the equipment and taking off our shoes and jewelry and all this stuff, we got to this big, huge prison door, just as it imagines, like one of these, big things. And we're putting our shoes back on, and the guy says, "Who are you here to see?" And I said, very proud, I'm only a second-year lawyer, by the way, and I say, "Oh, hi, I'm Elisa Kaplan. I'm an attorney with the New England Innocence Project, and we're here to see Dennis Mayer." And he looked down at me and he said, "It's about time you got here." And that was our entry into meeting Dennis. And I looked at my student and I was like, whoa, And we met Dennis, and we actually found him very, kind of sad. He was sad. He was quiet. He's not the Dennis I know today at all. He was so, I'll let you describe your feelings, but you were so sort of overwhelmed, it seemed, that we were even there and that we were talking to him about his case. So it was incredibly emotional meeting.
Well, you figure I'd been in prison probably 16 and a half years, and everything I ever filed was denied without a hearing, or was denied. And then here comes the Innocence Project. You know, this is what I'm hoping for. And we sat down and talked, and then they said, we're here to represent you, which was overwhelming. Because my friend, her father, was working on his case too, which he was proven innocent also. And he was way ahead of me on this case. And so here I was, now I had lawyers, which I had never had. And they were going to help work on the case.
Yeah, so how do you work on one of these cases? Well, back then, and a little bit today, these cases are what we call DNA cases. And the whole goal is to find the evidence from the case and get DNA testing. And in a case like Dennis's, the DNA could exonerate him. That alone could help prove without question, prove his innocence, because these were sexual assault cases, there was semen and all of that. So today's cases, and I'm happy to answer questions about that stuff later, but they're way more complicated, and DNA is often one piece of the puzzle. But a case like Dennis's, it was all about finding the evidence from the case. And he had been looking for it for 10 years, and the National Innocence Project, had been looking for it and filed motions, and they just kept getting denied. And so our goal in this case was, first and foremost, learn everything there was to learn about the case, about Dennis, about his situation, and then figure out how we were going to find the evidence in the case. So we had learned from the national office and from cases that were already happening around the country that evidence can be found in crazy places. And I still use this today with my law students looking in Oregon, which is, never take no for an answer. Not until you feel that you have turned over every rock, you have spoken to every person. Don't just get the okay from the lab director. Speak to the people who did who touch evidence. Speak to every police officer that could have, touched the evidence. Speak to every lawyer involved in the case, because we even knew at the time of Dennis's case that evidence in cases could be found in crazy places. In the desk drawer of one of the prosecutors, in the lab book of a lab technician that had done some examination of evidence, which was at home because he was retired. So people were successful in finding evidence from different cases and then exonerating someone with evidence in these crazy places. But in this case, we had something extra special. We had a case that happened, an exoneration that happened in February 2001. Kenny Waters, which later became the major motion picture Conviction. I was totally cut out of it, by the way. I was like, what about me? I worked on this case. But in Kenny's case, his amazing sister, Betty Ann Waters, was searching for the evidence, learned about DNA, and was searching for the evidence in his case, and eventually found it in the basement of the courthouse, in the Middlesex County Courthouse. And so we thought, well, if Kenny's evidence was there, and interestingly, we can get more into this too, but one of the main detectives in Kenny's case, and it happens at around the same time as Dennis's case, worked on Dennis's case too. We later learned how important that was, but we figured around the same time, same area, same, everything, same detective, maybe Dennis's evidence is in the basement of the courthouse, right? At least we were gonna try, because we had this precedent. So we called the DA and we said, hey, can you look in the courthouse? The DA, by the way, was Martha Coakley. Some of you might know her. And we called her and we said, could you look in the basement? Do you have any other ideas? No. But what about the evidence from Kenny Waters? Can someone just look? No, it's not there. When Kenny Waters' case happened, I was told on the phone, we looked down there to make sure there was nobody else. So of course there's no evidence down there. I was told that over the phone. We tried filing motions to get, we drafted motions and threatened to file them. Somebody please look in the basement. Nobody would do that for us. Nobody would listen to us. And then we decided to sort of take matters into our own hands. So Karen, my amazing law student, decided to go just hang out at the courthouse and kind of find out, like, who's in charge, how does this work? I'll just go ask, rather than all this lawyery stuff, right? So Karen was at the courthouse and she made friends at eating lunch with someone from the courthouse that worked in the courthouse. And she told him, we'd really like to know what's in the basement. And he, who remained anonymous throughout Dennis's entire thing, because he didn't want to lose his job, went down to the basement of the courthouse, and there were boxes down there that said, Mayor, 3 boxes. And he came up and said that, and that's when I went pretty much insane and crazy. That's when I went down to the courthouse and started screaming at people. The really amazing stuff, the amazing thing about doing this work back then is there were really no rules. There was no procedural rules, and there was no, real way to go about these cases. And in some ways, it was worse for the clients, and in some ways, it was better for the clients. So I was able to basically call and yell and scream and say, if you don't, get me those boxes immediately to the crime lab, and I want to know chain of custody, I want to know everything, and I will watch them go. I am not trusting you anymore, that's it. And they did it really fast. The other really weird part of this case was that happened, and then the other thing is they assigned a junior prosecutor on the case from the beginning. They thought like, oh, this isn't going anywhere. And they assigned this really junior prosecutor that I was dealing with all the time. Well, it turns out that junior prosecutor, do you remember this part? No. I used to babysit his wife. So we had this, he was like, oh my God, are you Lisa Kaplan from New Jersey? Oh yeah, my wife grew up, you guys went to Solomon Schechter together. And you knew that, right, Mom? You didn't know this part? Sarah Buchholz's sister. Yeah, see, you knew that? So we had this personal connection, and he was officially assigned to this case. So once the evidence was sort of relinquished, I had this great other young lawyer working with me that we also had a personal connection, and he was very committed to justice. So we got this lawyer, David, and I got the evidence to go right to the crime lab. We also had a great person at the crime lab, Kelly, right? And we stood there, David and me and one of my students and maybe one of his students, and sat there with the analyst at the Massachusetts Crime Lab, and pulling things out of this box and numbering them and marking them. And she had this special wand that she went over where you could see if there was DNA or potential DNA. And all the stuff, there was clothes, there was everything was lighting up. And of course, I was jumping up and down. Back then, you needed like a pool of blood or a pool of semen or something. Now, you can have a pinprick, but back then you needed a significant amount. So she confirmed that there was DNA in a lot of this evidence, and we were gonna get it done. And then we fought for a while about who was gonna do the testing, right? What was going on for you during?
Well, first she called me and said they found the evidence, and she said, well, how come you're not reacting? I says, well, I've had so much negativity, let something really good happen. So, and then she said, there's DNA on the evidence. And then so, I guess Kelly decided that she didn't want to do the testing because it was old evidence. So they sent it out to Dr. Blake in California.
In fact, Kelly carried it. We paid for Kelly to go on an airplane to California holding the evidence from Dennis's case. And good for her for saying that maybe she couldn't do a good enough job and that it had to be done by someone who had more of an expertise.
Now, Dr. Blake is one of the foremost forensic, well, he's retired now, but he's one of the foremost forensic scientists in the country. But he's not recognized by the government because he hates the government.
He won't get his accreditation. He never got his accreditation. Right.
So then the next step was...
But we got the prosecutors to agree to let him do it because the Massachusetts Crime Lab said, no, he's the best, let him do it. But we fought about it in court.
So the next step is they got to get my DNA. So they called me down to the health services unit, and they got me in a holding cell. In walks someone from the AG's office, someone from the DA's office, lawyers, a phlebotomist, the superintendent, IPS, and there were like 6 or 7 other people in the holding cell with me, and they're all freaking out thinking they're coming for their DNA. So I told them, I says, no, they're here for me, don't worry. You can see them all relaxed because they figured they're going to get charged with more crimes that they didn't get caught for. So we set up a chain of evidence. They took pictures of them taking a mouth swab. Then they took pictures of them taking my blood, and they handed it all to the state trooper who brought it to the Kelly, who flew that out to California. And then Eliza says, call me on Christmas Eve of 2002. So I get out of work and I calls Eliza 25 times, and there was no answer. So they locked me in my cell for lunch, and I come out from lunch and there's still no answer. And I went outside and took a walk because I was probably mad. And then finally I come back in and the block officer says, Dennis, call your lawyer. I said, I've been calling her all day. So I calls her and she says, you've been excluded. Well, I says, where were you? She says, we were out celebrating. We had 2 exclusions today. And you're one of them.
That's exactly what I said.
Now, what that means is the DNA doesn't match me, but the victim could have had sex with their boyfriend or husband the night before. So now they have to go see the victim. Now, this is just in the Lowell case. So Martha Coakley goes and talks to the victim, and she flips out. Can you imagine, this is almost 19 years later, and now they got to tell her that you may have sent an innocent man to prison, and the guy who did the crime may still be out there. So they went and saw her a second time, and she still freaked out, and they asked her for permission to get the hospital records, which can only be gotten through a court order or permission from the victim. So she gave them their permission. They went and looked at their hospital records, and they found out that she was a virgin when she was raped. So I was exonerated in Lowell. Now that's just the Lowell case. Now we got the Air case, and they hadn't found the evidence for that one yet. Excuse me.
And we were negotiating behind the scenes, trying to get Martha to say, like, enough, he didn't do this. The other crime was so dissimilar that it was clear that they were just kind of swept Dennis in. Are those tissues? It was clear that they just swept both cases in. They said, this is the guy who did it, and we were pleading with her. And she wouldn't budge.
And then I called Eliza, and she says, a slide just showed up on Martha Coakley's desk from the Air case. Where it came from, nobody knows. But we're sending it to a place in Washington, D.C. to be DNA tested.
Right. It was like miraculously the evidence from Dennis's case.
So I called her on April Fool's Day, 2003.
Right.
And she says, when do you want to go home? I said, well, you better wait 2 days because my parents got to adjust to this.
Yeah. I did say that.
So on April 3rd, 2003, 19 years, 2 months, and 29 days later, I walked into the Cambridge courthouse. I was late. Eliza was flipping out. Where is he? Where is he? Now at this time, you got to remember, Boston traffic was a nightmare because the big dig was in high program, so you had to go south to go north, and of course we were late. So we get up there and she comes down and she says, you ready? I said, yeah. And then there's a guy in the holding cell next to us crying because he's going to get a 3 to 5. And I says, listen, I'm going home today. I did 19 years, 2 months, and 29 days, and I'm proven innocent. I didn't hear another peep out of it. So we went upstairs, And then she comes back in again, she says, "You ready?" I says, "Yeah." And there was a reporter from the Boston Globe, Dick Lair, who was doing an article on me. And so we went into the courtroom, and my mother didn't know who I was, because I was in a suit. And then she read her motions, and Martha Coakley said that they're not going to go against him. And the judge said, "All I have to do is sign these papers and he can go home." And he said, and they said, "Yes, Your Honor." And he said, "Well, I'm signing the papers, he can leave." So they brought me back in the back. He said, "You're not going in the cell, sit on the bench." He took my ankle bracelets off, my waist chains, and said, "You can leave." So I walked out the first door. I met with my parents and Eliza. I walked through the second door, met with the rest of my family and friends. I walked through the third door into a media circus. There were like 9 TV cameras and probably 15 microphones. And of course, the first question they asked is, "How do you feel?" I wanted to scream, "How do you think I feel?" But I said, "I'm a little overwhelmed right now." And then here comes Eliza and says, "There's a press conference at Tester, Horowitz, and Tebow at noontime, and we'll see you all there."
Yeah, working for the firm. Yeah, always.
And then as we were leaving, the senior court officer comes over and says, "Dennis, Jay Carney would like to speak with you." Now, Jay Carney, as
Some
a
of you
lot
know
of you
now.
know, he represented Whitey Bulger just recently. But back in 1984, he prosecuted me. And so the senior court officer says, "Jay Carney would like to speak with you." And he apologized to me in tears. And I forgave him. And we're friends now. We go speak together at Harvard University or, other places. And he told me that if I would not have forgiven him, he probably would not be a lawyer right now. Because he knew about the case as it was going on. Because he told me Barry Scheck would call him and said,
I call him too.
he said, "Dennis has been exonerated in one case." And then he called him again and said, "Dennis is innocent." And he said it had a humongous effect on him. And that me forgiving him has made him a better person.
And I'll add that during the case, I spoke to Jay a few times, and I said, how can you help us? I won't speak totally for him, but the story he tells is that after he tried Dennis's case, he went to the head of the public appeals here in Middlesex, and he said, "You have to give this man a good lawyer on appeal, because I did everything, I was supposed to do as the prosecutor, but he had the worst defense lawyer I have ever seen in my life, and he needs someone good on appeal." So, that's what the prosecutor was saying, and it turned out Dennis did have one of the worst lawyers ever, who was disbarred shortly after Dennis's case. And I don't know how many people here are lawyers, but it's really hard to get disbarred.
Well, he got disbarred twice.
Twice, yeah.
First time he got disbarred for a year, and then he got disbarred for life.
And when we were not sure if we were going to be able to prove Dennis's second case innocent, we had already written a brief we were about to file, that basically one of the main arguments was that he deserved a new trial because how poor his lawyer was. And I think it would have been successful because it allowed us to go through the record in such a meticulous way that we were overwhelmed and shocked. And he took all your family's money, and never went to the scene of the crime, never looked for any evidence. Dennis's lineup was photographed with the chair in front of him. Not only do we not do lineups like that now, even then, that was a, travesty of justice. It's like basically pointing to the person, that chair in front of him. When I saw that, I freaked. And we had already prepared the brief to get him a new trial when, miraculously, that extra evidence had turned up. And I've never talked to Jay about it, but I feel like he had something to do with it, right?
It's possible.
Yeah, we don't know.
So we went to the press conference, and someone asked me, what are you going to do? I said, well, I'm going to go home and make my father a grandfather. So we left the law firm, went home, and my mother said, you're grounded. And then I proceeded to get my life back together. You know, it's a long process. You know, when I was in prison, there was a process that you had to do a release plan. I told him, I says, I'll do a verbal release plan, but I'm not going to put in writing because I may die in prison. So I said, I get out through DNA. I take 2 months off, I find a job, I meet a woman, we get married and we have children, we buy a house. I get out through DNA, I took 2 months off. I've worked for Waste Management 2 months after I get out of prison. I met my wife online, I met her on Yahoo. We got married. We have 2 children. Joshua. And Eliza Karen Lucy. Because there is no way I can pay Eliza for what she did for me. So I named my daughter after her.
Yeah, and now our kids play. It's pretty great. Dennis is one of very few exonerees that have come out and so beautifully and successfully really gotten, you know, back to living in such an extraordinary way. And I think your family gets a lot of credit and you get so much credit. And, you know, Dennis was at the Massachusetts Treatment Center, which is filled with sex offenders, but one of the things that they have there, because it's filled with sex offenders and people who are civilly committed, and by the way, Dennis's was the first case in the history of Massachusetts to have a civil commitment reversed, which was pretty exciting.
I told her she had
legally.
to file, so she had to file a motion. She said, why?
Why?
I said,
What
it's
is
a
this
civil
crazy
commitment.
rule, right? So we had to do that. But you know, he got a lot of therapy there. And really got to work on the anger that he thankfully doesn't have, like a lot of exonerees do. So he spends so much of his time helping other exonerees and really being a great listener to them and supportive of them. And, you know, he's really exemplary in every way, how he's lived his life and made all of his dreams come true. So I'm honored to know him. Anything else?
So now what I do is, I do a lot of public speaking. I came here, I speak at a lot of the colleges in the area. Excuse me, I speak at law firms, high schools. And then I go to the State House to help change laws in this state and other states.
It does.
I helped change a DNA law in Maine. I helped create a DNA law in Vermont. We just went to Colorado earlier this year for witness identification. I helped create the Massachusetts DNA law. And hopefully we're going to have witness identification change soon. But it's my way of giving back to the Innocence Project for what they gave to me.
And what I do now is I moved to Portland, Oregon, and I'm a law professor out there.
She made me come speak.
And he's already been out there speaking to my students. But, you know, I took a few years off from Innocence work, and I moved out to Oregon for this job, and literally on my first day, everyone's like, are you going to start an Innocence project? So when I got out there, I learned that Oregon was the only state that didn't have an Innocence project yet. So about a year and a half ago, we launched the Oregon Innocence Project, and we also have a clinic associated with the Lewis and Clark Law School where I work. So, you know, the work continues.
Mm-hmm.
for sharing it for us. I'm assuming there may be some questions in the audience, and I'm happy to share mine. Let's do this.
I think everyone in the room is thankful that exoneration happened. You spent approximately half of your working life without any income, without any support of any kind. You're now free. But is there any justification or methodology or legal precedent to say, I want some of that made up, other than just something like freedom?
Well, I filed lawsuits. I settled with the town of Lowell, the city of Lowell for nowhere near enough, and I won 3.1 million from the town of Air. Plus, I received 500,000 from the state, which is all that you can get.
When someone's exonerated, there's usually, depending on the state, there's usually three options. One is your state might have a law, compensation law, that you could file under. And most of those, not every state has them, and most of them are pretty bad laws that they weren't written with people like Dennis in mind. They were written a long time ago for other types of stories. You can file a lawsuit, as Dennis did. In order to be successful in a lawsuit like that, you have to prove intent. Basically that the government actor intended to harm you. It's very, very difficult to prove. Rarely does it work. If you're lucky like Dennis is, they'll settle just to make it go away and not keep going. But a lot of guys don't even have that, and women, I should say, more and more women are being exonerated. And then the third way is to go to your legislature and ask them to do a special private bill for an individual, which has worked in a number of cases around the country. And I just also want to add that, Dennis, what number exoneration were you? I know it's on your license plate, but
127.
127, and today there are over 350 DNA exonerations and 1,679 total exonerations, which include those 350. And those are just the cases that we have been able to prove. Most people that are innocent, that are in jail, and studies and statistics show that it could be in the thousands and thousands and thousands. We will never be able to prove their innocence.
Well, if you just look at it as, there's roughly 2 million people involved in some way with the prison system, be it on probation, parole. If 1% of them is innocent, that's 20,000 people.
Yeah,
They think it's closer to 5%.
yeah, but we won't be able to prove most of them. It's, so.
You've been treated by the Innocence Project, and you do a call read. What will it read once you appeal?
It took 10 years to clear my name. They offered to clear my name if I dropped all my lawsuits. But I said, I guess I'll wait.
You guess what?
I told them, I guess I'll wait. And then after that, it was a fight in court. The state wanted to keep everything, saying that, oh, we may prosecute again if we find the person. And the judge said, listen, you've had 10 years, you ain't doing nothing. You better come up with a better excuse than that and clear his name. And so the judge ordered my name cleared.
And that's common in most states. It's almost as hard to expunge your record when you've been proven innocent and exonerated as it is to get yourself out of jail. And that's the law. The expungement laws, again, they're not set up for people who have been exonerated. So Dennis, at the beginning, when he was looking for work, would carry around his exoneration papers and his articles of him in the newspaper when he was looking for work, you know, to say like, look. But obviously, if you're applying for housing or other, you know, all these other things, it doesn't help. It doesn't always help.
There's so many betrayals of Dennis, and it's spoken of the state versus Dennis. And one of the things that he spoke of, I don't know if it came out clearly enough, was that when you were committed civilly to the sex offenders unit, there were 3 conditions that had you committed to that unit. And discuss the 3, especially the one that if you don't admit you're guilty, you can't avoid commitment.
Well, there are a lot more things that can get you committed, but those were the 3 that they used against me. They used denial, because I denied the crimes. Well, I didn't do the crimes, so I wasn't going to admit to them. multiple offenses. I had a rape, an attempted rape, and an aggravated rape that I was charged with, not to mention the numerous other charges. And violence, there was a knife involved. They never tested the knife for blood, it would have had fish blood on it. But that's part of the things that got me civilly committed.
And that basically converted your prior sentence into a life sentence?
I was already doing second-degree life, it just gave me another life sentence on top of that one.
It means he was never getting out.
Yeah, they never had to let me go.
Kind of a two-part question. Have you ever run into the judge who prosecuted you or met him professionally? And
I was-
did the DNA ever come up in the DNA database?
No,
Other
the-
conflict or something?
The DNA never made it to the database
And-
because they said the statute of limitations had run out.
Yeah, it's really common in these cases that prosecutors, not all, but a lot of times they fight you and fight you and fight you and fight you, and then you exonerate, and then you say, run it in the databank, run it in the databank. Not all of our DNA statutes, not every state requires it, and then they don't run it in the databank because, for numerous reasons. It just never, it's like, are you interested in solving this case? I mean, even if you can't prosecute them, why not for the victim's sake? The victims get, it's horrible, in these types of cases. The lawyer and, defense, the innocent defense, we're not allowed to speak to the victims, and it's probably inappropriate if we do. Although I've never had a client that wasn't like Dennis, who it was on the front of his brain the whole time. Is the victim okay? Does she know I'm getting out? Does she know, but, very often the DNA results do not go through a data bank, even in murder cases I've had.
I was in a movie called After Innocence. It follows me and 6 other exonerees and how society treats us. At the very beginning of that, my judge is on there.
Mm-hmm.
And they still believe, I've heard that he still believes I'm guilty.
It would mean he would have to admit he was wrong.
Right. And now the police officer that arrested me in Lowell just retired as the commissioner of police with Boston.
Yeah.
Eddie Davis. He arrested me in Lowell.
A lot of times people prosecute or are involved in these cases on the state side, and then they become judges, and then they become the attorney general, and then they become the chief of police in Boston. I see it all the time.
I have a general question about the Innocence Project. Do you see a geographic bias? Or is this kind of 50 states and it's kind of everywhere?
There are definitely innocent people in jail everywhere. Obviously, in states that have higher prison populations, there's a lot more action. Florida, Pennsylvania, New York, Texas, Illinois, Massachusetts, the high population states are the most. And what I always found interesting is, there's certain states where it's unbelievable. I mean, it just feels unbelievable. And by the way, Massachusetts is one of them. And I remember being kind of shocked about that. It made me really sad. I remember studying for the bar here and thinking, we have the best laws, it's such a progressive, I feel that way in Oregon too. And we have innocent people in Oregon too. And, so obviously everywhere, higher populations. And then, what you see over so many years, I've been doing this work now for, 15 years. And what you see is, and what the cases show, is that the same things happen over and over again. And so what we've been able to do from the 350 plus DNA exonerations and from the over 1,600 total wrongful convictions, those of us that do the work, these cases have been examined. And what we learn is that, there's a handful of what we call causes of wrongful convictions. Mistaken identification, leading cause of wrongful convictions. One, because the way we used to do lineups and photo arrays and all that was wrong and against the science. Memory is not a tape recording. And so there's 30 years of science that show that. Massachusetts and actually Oregon are the two states that are leading the changes for changing the way we do eyewitness identification. So that's a leading cause. Bad forensic science and invalid science, whether it's a scandal in your crime lab, and we all have one, which is a big deal here in Boston, or whether it's using forensic science that was just created for criminal cases, like dog bite science and microscopic hair analysis. These are not real sciences. These that have been rigorously tested and examined and challenged. These are sciences that were created to solve crimes. So you see both of those in these wrongful convictions. You see horrible, disgusting defense lawyering. You see overzealous prosecutors and police officers, either intentionally or unintentionally. A lot of these things are not intentional. And you see, let me think, what am I missing? False confessions. 25% of DNA exonerations involve someone falsely confessing, and then also a higher percentage people pleading to crimes they didn't commit to avoid higher sentences. Obviously, in death penalty states, that's a huge one to get out of the death penalty. Torture?
And,
For false confessions?
Yeah.
Yeah, people are tortured. We use a ridiculous system of interrogating people. And what you see out of these, 1,600 plus cases is that most of these cases have a few of those going on, right? So in Dennis's case, he had a horrible, terrible lawyer, no question. That could have been enough, as far as I'm concerned, to say his trial wasn't valid. He had mistaken identification. The victims in the case really thought he was the person. They didn't do anything wrong. They thought he was the person. They were led to believe, right, subtly, that he was the person. They did the best they can. That's what mistaken identification is. It's often a mistake, or people get, just by one comment or one little thing, get geared towards the person that the police want them to pick.
well, in the identification process in the Air case, Nancy Taylor Harris, who was the arresting officer, went to the victim with 10 pictures. And she showed her the 10 pictures. And she said, well, none of them resemble him. She says, well, you had a reaction when you looked at this picture, which
That's
was
it.
my picture.
That's all it takes.
And she said, well, it was him then.
So we'd like to think that we've learned from these, since the first DNA exonerations in the early 90s, we've examined these cases, and those of us that do this work, we're not just working on casework. In fact, I don't really work on casework anymore. What I do is I work to change the laws and the policies and to make sure that, the police are using different kinds of eyewitness mechanisms. I'm filing lawsuits and, writing amicus briefs in, Supreme Courts and courts of appeals around the country to say, hey, you need to do this differently, and here's why. So we're trying to use all the data and all the information from these causes of wrongful convictions around the country to change the policies and change the laws. If not, then Dennis's case is in vain, right? I mean, we have to use it. He's been tremendous here in Massachusetts, changing the law.
What are the laws like for, keeping evidence and for the duration that you keep evidence and how easy it is to find evidence? And obviously in this case, that was huge.
Yeah, one of the problems with preservation of evidence laws, and they also vary by state and depending on the types of crimes. For many years, states didn't have any real rules about it. I know, at least in my state, Oregon, they didn't pass a preservation law until 2011. So we're just really screwed on DNA cases. In Massachusetts, once some of this stuff started coming up, like in the 90s and late 90s, they quickly ran to establish laws. And so depending on the type of crime, it might depend on how long the evidence is kept. Certainly in felonies, rapes, murders, they keep the evidence now for a really long time. And as you probably know from watching TV, they use DNA on the front end now, every single case. So, and then they still have to preserve the evidence.
Your comment that the prison guard made to you about So that's why you got here is fascinating. And to me, it speaks to a lot more than, the time you gave it. Do you think there's a way to tap into that sort of knowledge to help identify?
Yeah, I mean, I tell that story a lot, and because I feel like when you're in, Dennis, you can support this or not, but it seems to me, and this is true with other clients and situations I've been in, that like in the prison, the other people that are serving time and the guards and everything really have a good idea of what's going on and who committed the crime. And so, I use that now a little bit more. While it won't happen maybe spontaneously that way, I actually was working on a case this week where the guy tells me, all the police officers knew I didn't do it. And, they just went along with it, even though they knew she did it, kind of thing. And so in my head, I'm like, make a list of police officers and go talk to them. Some of them will be retired. So I do think that they're, right? I mean, when you're in prison, you all know. I mean, you'll talk
Well, a lot of
about it,
them, a lot of the correctional officers will observe the people and how they interact. And they knew I didn't do a lot of the stuff that the rest of the inmates did. Like, I didn't try to get them to bring me in illegal stuff or anything like that. I talked to them, I looked them in the eye. I wasn't trying to scam them into doing something for me. And they knew that, and they knew that I was always trying to get my case in court.
There's other things, like I feel like if someone goes before a parole board and won't admit that they committed the crime, or someone just won't ever admit that they committed the crime, like Dennis didn't, like there's little things like that that I would say are really helpful for you feeling like, wow, I think this, I really believe in this person.